With unprecedented high rates of divorce, both technical divorce and emotional divorce, one of the greatest questions, perhaps in all of history, but especially in our time, is how can we build strong and unbreakable relationships? Everything in life seems to be temporary. Can we hope to create something enduring? And that is the topic we will be discussing. How to build strong and unbreakable relationships. Hi, this is Rabbi Jacobson. Welcome. We've just concluded the holiday season, the Jewish holiday season, which is rich with meaning and spiritual energy. So we will be speaking about a topic that is extremely relevant to all of us. How to build strong and unbreakable relationships. This program is dedicated by Seymour Dorfman in honor and memory of his wife Rivka Bat Shloma Salman. We live in a world where we know that things are, we call them temporal, temporary, impermanent. The food you eat, the money you make, our youth, our looks, and so many other areas of our lives that, as special as they may be, they come and go. We all die. Mortality. We're subject to the elements and to the rules of nature that do not allow things to be eternal. We are not immortal. And yet, there is that hope and belief, especially when we're younger and idealistic, more idealistic, that we look for love forever after. Is that truly possible? And if so, how? How can we actually build strong and unbreakable relationships? It would seem to defy the rules of every aspect of existence. That's what we'll be discussing. And especially in these days when we're all under extra strain and pressure due to the lockdowns, the temporary lockdowns, the on and offs, the ups and downs that the pandemic is creating in our lives. So yes, for some of us and many of us, perhaps that's strengthening our relationships, but it also can put extra pressure in a relationship that has not been so healthy in the first place. So this isn't just a nice abstract topic, it's actually quite relevant, and I would even say a matter of life and death in many ways. I don't mean death physically, but we know to not have a healthy, enduring, trusting emotional relationship affects us and has implications in every aspect of our lives. So when we speak about it in that way, it really is necessary to address, and often it's not addressed. We often deal with the symptoms. People say, my life isn't working out, I'm not happy, not satisfied. And often when you begin to trace the steps, to trace the steps to what is the root of the issue, it's very often connected to our relationships that we've had with our parents as children, with our siblings, with friends, peers, with our social circles, and above all, our intimate relationships, our romantic relationships. So this is a subject that affects so much of life that when you can address that and build the foundation properly, the rest of the building usually follows. Obviously, nothing is automatic, and there's no magic tricks, both for building and maintaining strong and unbreakable relationships, but also in other areas of life. But there are principles. And when you look through history and you look at people who have built successful relationships, there are certain elements that you discover that some of them are actually quite obvious, some are even counterintuitive, and many are things that we all can understand, common sense, and yet what's difficult is emotionally bringing yourself there. That's why we often can give good advice to others about how to mend and how to build their relationships when we don't even apply that necessarily that advice to ourselves. Now, an interesting way, which is like a scientific method, let's call it, to look at anything that you want to build, fix, repair. But let's not talk about even fixing or repairing right now. Let's just talk about building something that's enduring, that's lasting, strong and unbreakable. So an interesting way the scientific method teaches us is to look at things that cause a relationship or whatever it is that we're discussing that causes it to break, that causes it to be severed in some way. Because when you can see it on one extreme, then you can say, okay, so what do we have to do to counter those factors that cause a relationship not to last? So let's try to define a few key elements, ingredients that make for a relationship not lasting. And the truth is, as I said, this can be applied to many other areas in life. I mentioned before the example of a foundation and a structure, a building. It's a very good example in certain elements to our discussion here. When you build a good building, a strong building, we know that there are many factors that make that building sound. And I'm not talking about the cosmetics and the outer beauty and the furnishings that come later. I'm talking about the actual structure itself. What's the first step of all? Besides, of course, the blueprint and the plan and make sure that everything is covered, the actual foundation, the foundation of the building that most of us never even see through our lifetimes when we live or dwell in that particular structure. It's beneath the ground. You see it when they begin building, and it actually doesn't even look very glamorous. Concrete, you see these pipes coming out of it, which make the concrete stronger. If you know even more some of the architecture and engineering involved in foundations, you know the foundation has to be on solid bedrock. If there's, for example, even a dry little rivulet that was once there, can cause problems. You can't have cracks. The foundation has to be extremely solid and unwavering, like the roots of a tree, which is another analogy. Once you have that in place, you begin building the structure. And you can build a structure of many floors, of many stories. But we have 100-story buildings, we have 120-story, I don't even know what the tallest buildings are. But there are many, many stories. But if the foundation is not in place, the stories, as beautiful as they may be, the floors and the floor plans, it won't stand. And a lot is to be taken into consideration. Because remember, when a building gets taller, a skyscraper, also, as you know, some of them have to be built in a way that sway in the wind, not sway in very extreme ways, but like a bridge. Not a what do we call them? Forgot the name for it. A bridge that has those. It'll come to me shortly. So you have a bridge. If you ever walk on a bridge, you see it shakes a bit because it absorbs the pressures of whatever is riding on it. It actually gives it more strength, that flexibility. And we'll be discussing that shortly. So in that sense, the foundation is the fundamental and most important component of it all. And as the building is built, this foundation has to be able to account for every possible scenario. Because if it's not in place, that, as I said, the upper stories are not going to compensate. Expansion bridge, that's what I was going to say. Not a expansion bridge, which is very much not, it's different than a foundation in a building, but it needs that flexibility. So people actually can tell or sense very subtly, if you go up to very high skyscrapers, you can sense the wind, there's a slight shifts that take place in order to compensate and allow to deal with that. If it was too rigid, it would not be able to stand. But let's get back to the foundation. So the foundation is invisible to the naked eye. And yet it is the solid base upon which everything will last. If the foundation is weak, you can imagine that the building will ultimately be weak. And even though it can stand for a while, there will be enough pressure, enough challenge, enough resistance, enough something that will be unnatural or beyond the natural, like a great storm or earthquake, it will impact it. In California, there are building guidelines exactly how you build the foundations, in order again to compensate for earthquakes, because the country, the state, and many parts of it are built on the San Andreas fault and other faults. So if you look at something that breaks, you have to always ask yourself, what caused it to break? Is it an immediate thing that caused it, or maybe the foundation was not put into place properly? And that's, of course, what I'm submitting here as our key point of discussion. That is the foundation that is vital. And when that foundation is not in place, it doesn't mean it cannot last. There are many reasons people stay together in relationships that are not necessarily because they love each other or because they can stand each other. Is because convenience, the unknown evil is worse than the known evil, children, financial reasons. So we're discussing here a relationship that's not just being certain survival mode or an automatic pilot mode, but rather one that actually does have an enduring element, two people who love each other forever and ever. So when you look at things that cause break in a relationship context, what is the foundational elements? Obviously, it's not a physical foundation, as it is in a building, or like it is in a tree, the roots of a tree. So what is it? It comes down to a few key words. When there's no trust, two parties don't have trust or lose trust in each other, that is foundational. Yes, can they make lunch for each other? Can they go out and have fun? Can they even be intimate with each other? Yes, they can. But one could argue that it's going to be compromised because they're overlooking something. There's a lack of trust. And lack of trust goes along the spectrum, can be some things that are more extreme and some things that are more severe. But trust and lack of trust is definitely foundational. Now, why did I begin with trust? Why didn't I begin with love? Because we see that people have love and they don't have trust. They have love and they don't have other elements. It's not enough. Or maybe you can argue it's not true love. The fact that someone falls passionately in love with someone else can also be a crush. It could be a momentary thing. It can last a day, it can last a year, it can last a few years. Love is not as simple as it sounds in the books and in the movies. True love is enduring. Actually, I would argue that you don't know two people love each other until you see years later what happens when they're tested and challenged, which leads me to the next point in the scientific method. You want to test something for what makes it break or not break, you have to put it under all circumstances. Extreme cold temperatures, extreme hot temperatures, heavy pressured situations, other factors that go into the environment. Because if you put something in a particular condition, let's say perfect weather condition, yeah, that may last, but put it into extreme heat or extreme cold, or in dark or light or other factors, and you suddenly see it's not enduring. So in the scientific method, you need to be able to also prove and demonstrate that it can endure all kinds of different pressures or different conditions and situations. And the same thing in a personal relationship. You want to really know what it's like, you have to see it under duress, challenged. Now, no one should be challenged. I hope everybody has beautiful, smooth life, but that's not the case in reality. What happens then when there is a challenge? And it may not be a challenge that one person hurt the other. It could be an outside challenge, a health issue, a loss in a family, a quarrel or an argument by other family members. And of course, it could also be between the parties themselves. Some form of betrayal, some form of breach. That's when you start seeing what you're made of. What metal are you made of? Can it endure? Again, endure not just for convenience purposes, but endure actually, there's something deeper that can be accessed to help mend that relationship. So all these factors are vital and critical when addressing this topic. So far what we've said is things like trust plus love. Yes, you can have trust and not have love. You can trust your doctor, you can trust your lawyer, you can trust a partner in business. That doesn't mean you love them in the romantic sense of the word, in an intimate sense of a relationship. So trust plus love. What else would go into this ingredient? So let's go back to the roots and to the foundation. They have something about them, as I mentioned, I want to go back to the word unwavering. Nothing shifts. Yes, roots grow, of course. But once they implant themselves, embed themselves, and a foundation is in place, It doesn't shift. It doesn't shift with the winds. If there are any shifts to compensate for some type of issue, that's also part of its endurance, part of its strength. So in personal relationships, that you can know there's a consistency. Now you can say this is an extension of trust, and it actually is. You say a trusting foundation. I can trust this foundation. I trust these roots. But I'm adding another element. It's not just the trust. You trust because you see a consistency. That the person that loves you is not conditional love only when it's convenient. It's like a foundation. It's always there. Even when you're asleep, even when you're not watching, you know that someone has your back. You know that this person will not hurt you. You know this person will love you, will stand by you, even when things are difficult. It brings to mind, the story is so moving that it comes to mind when I'm talking about this topic. Unfortunately, a husband and wife, they grew older. The woman, the wife, the mother and wife, contracted Alzheimer's, and she began to lose her memory slowly. We all know it's a devastating disease. In some ways, some people say it's worse than death itself, because you see a person that you respected, self-respect, trusted, losing and not in their control. It's one of the hardest things to witness. And yes, in this case, this woman began to forget her children's names, her grandchildren, and ultimately even began to forget her husband. She was and yet his commitment was so deep to her. He would come visit her. She was already in a place that she needed assistance. She had a nurse, a 24-hour nurse, and the nurse says to him, "You keep coming every day to see your wife. She doesn't recognize you anymore. And there's no real point to come." And he responded, "Yes, but I recognize her." This is an unwavering foundation. It's not about what you get for it. There's a connection that's there no matter what happens. Now, of course, you'll say, that's beautiful, very sentimental, very touching, but how do we achieve that? Well, of course, that's what we're getting to. So the next point that I made after trust is the issue of consistency. Now, consistency doesn't mean a boring clerk type that you can just rely on like a clock that has no life to it. Which leads me to the next thing. You need something dynamic. Going back to the foundation and the roots of a tree are necessary, but then the tree grows and branches out. And if it's a fruit tree, it bears fruit. And it continues to grow and expand. But it's precisely because it has those solid roots that gives it the confidence. I'm using a psychological term, but in a metaphorical way. It gives it that, once it's there, deep roots will bear beautiful fruits and enduring fruits. So the next element is the aspect, and the same thing with foundation. Foundation is the foundation. Then you build the structure, and the structure can be many different floors, many different stories for different functions. It can be a dynamic structure, a dynamic building, a dynamic home and mansion. So the consistency that I was talking about, the unwavering, comes as well, allowing now that the elements that are built upon this foundation can expand. So in another aspect, in a healthy, enduring relationship, you'll see that each partner grows, flourishes. They're not being suffocated. They're not being constrained either by fear or judgment or pleasing the other. So the consistency and the foundational element actually brings out the best in each one of them, which is yet another component. And why is that so necessary? Because let's, for argument's sake, you have one person who's a very aggressive partner and one is very passive. So you think it's a perfect match. But the truth is, if one person has to suffocate themselves, has to annihilate or obliterate or in any way compromise themselves in order for the relationship to endure, something's wrong. The beauty is when each partner, two spouses, they both grow, then you know the foundation is really solid. Because the foundation is not conditional based on one person dominating over the other, or one person controlling the situation. Which leads me to the next word, control. Control. How important is control in your life? I will tell you that even though it sounds like so beautiful to have, I'm in control. When you're driving a car, you want to be in control. You want the captain of a ship to be in control. You want a pilot to be in control. But when it comes to relationship, control is actually destructive. Yes, you want to be in control of your own emotions. You want to be in control of circumstances, but not control each other. Control is an outgrowth of insecurity. And insecurity is another word for mistrust. Not exactly another word, but the same idea. So security, trust, will allow a person to express themselves. Control means I need to control you, because if not, who knows what will happen. I don't know who coined the expression, but if true love is like a bird, let the bird out of the cage. Let them fly. Let the bird fly and see if it returns. Then you know you're really connected. But very often our own insecurities and fears, and sometimes they may be even based on things, is fear of abandonment, fear of betrayal, fear of jealousies, competition, doesn't allow us to let the other person be. So we've covered a bunch of different ingredients necessary. Well, first, ingredients that are the ingredients for, you can basically say, a formula for failure, and things will break and not be indestructible, which tells us now what we need to do to build an enduring and indestructible relationship. And that is to include all these components necessary: trust, love, consistency, not trying to control the other, allowing your individuality to express itself. By no means does this exhaust the list, but it definitely is an important, most important elements. So that's then analyzed. So why doesn't, if this can be put down on paper, just like you bake a cake, this is the recipe for an enduring relationship. So why not? Why is it so difficult? Because we're dealing here with not elements like when it comes to a structure or a building, you can bring an architect, you can bring in engineers, they could analyze and say, okay, here's the flaw in the foundation. When it comes to human beings, you can't quite do it the same way. You still can do it, but you need different type of experts. You need experts on the soul. What makes a soul tick? So I always go back to the way we were meant to grow up in our homes, where we had unconditional love, which led to unconditional trust. Children naturally trust their parents, starting with the trust element. They only will stop trusting when there's no choice, when they're forced to. And even then, they struggle with it, which is why it's so complicated. You want to trust your parents. You expect to trust them. You expect love, not due to even common sense or logic. It's just a biological element. But if it's repeatedly not receiving the nurturing you deserve, the validation, the support, and so on, at some point, you begin to distrust. And sometimes you start distrusting yourself because you don't want to put it on your parent. It's too devastating. So you can't trust yourself. How are you going to trust somebody else? So it's no wonder, as we grow into mature adults, that trust is a very fundamental issue, which of course comes together with security, which in turn comes together with our never being able to expand and spread our wings, expressing our true selves. So all those elements I mentioned before, very easy to envision, especially in our day and age, how often we are hurt in that sense. So to say, okay, I'm going to build trust with another when I've never really built trust myself. So what do you do about that? Well, awareness is half the cure, always. The mere fact that you're aware, and that's why we talk about this. I have no illusions in thinking one conversation like this is going to suddenly heal relationships from beginning to end. But I do, absolutely confident and believe, because I've seen it work, I've seen the proof of concept, that when we become aware of these factors and not smoke screen them and distract ourselves and say, no, it's a different issue, dealing with the symptoms, with the stories, the flaws, instead of the foundation, that awareness is the beginning of all growth and all healing. And yes, indeed, the beginning of building strong and unbreakable relationships. No question. So look at yourself. That's the first thing. Introspection. I mentioned before the holiday season. If the holiday season means anything, it's about soul searching. It's about looking into your own self, to your psyche, to what works, what's not working, and saying, okay, let me look at my trust issues. Let me look at security. And you may even be able to identify the problem. That, again, does not automatically solve it. But the awareness is vital for two reasons. Because without awareness, you will be deflecting and looking at other issues and even developing another persona to compensate. And without awareness, you will be focusing completely not on the issue itself. Of the thousands of people I have met in counseling, in addressing, I always see the same pattern. And I do not like any type of textbook, one size fits all. Everything is case by case, but there is a pattern. A pattern we all have. It's just like anything. The pattern is we usually do not focus on the foundation, we focus on the symptoms. They're legitimate. Symptoms are real. When a person is bleeding, it's truly bleeding. It's not an illusion. But it's not the cause. The bleeding is not the cause, it's the result. The pain, the psychic pain, the anxiety, all the challenges in relationships are all real, but they are the result of underlying foundational elements. So awareness. Ask yourself about trust. Do you trust yourself, really? And I don't mean that arrogant way where you said, no one else took care of me, so I take care of myself, and that I trust. I don't mean that. Do you trust yourself in a deeper way? Do you trust your decisions? Is it easy for you to make a commitment? Or is it very difficult because you don't know? You remain stuck in doubt, paralyzed. Did you grow up in a home where trust was taken from you and security? Do you feel that you have not actualized yourself? Ask yourself why. These are all emotional factors, which is what makes it so difficult, because it's emotional. It's so much part of who we are. If we're asked to analyze something that doesn't affect us, you look at it, you research it, you evaluate it, you take it apart, you test it. But when it comes to ourselves, besides the bias and the self-love and the distortions of subjectivity, it's just impossible to really look at yourself completely in a clear light. And especially if the emotions are driven by fear or insecurity or trust issues. Because that, by definition, shapes how you think. And will even deny certain things, will even ignore certain issues. That's why it's important to have another person that you can speak to. But here we got the catch-22. I don't trust. Who am I going to speak to? Well, this is no way to answer this except by saying it usually comes down to the path of least resistance. If it's more unpleasant to speak to someone than to deal with your problems, you're not going to speak to someone. If it's more unpleasant to continue living the way you are, limited, hurt, even perhaps depressed, relationships that don't endure, or you can't find relationships, and that's more painful than speaking with someone, then you'll speak to someone. I don't think you have to hit rock bottom for that, but the pain has to be greater with what you're dealing with. And that's the problem very often, because people don't want and they minimize. You know what? I can go on. I can manage. Is it great? No, it's not great. But other people are also lives that are also not great. If you take that attitude, then of course, you're probably not going to make any move. And no one can predict this. No one can tell you. So when speaking with people, what I always look for is try to address the issue, try to put it on the table. And then at the end of the day, you're going to have to make a decision. And I've seen this time and again that at the time, a person says, pushes it off. Nah, it's too uncomfortable. I can manage another day. But in time, if you plant the seed and the awareness has been ignited, it can take years. I've seen this many times. It could take months, but the seed has been planted. Remember, at the end of the day, we are healthy human beings. We are pure souls. That child may have been robbed of security, of confidence, and so on, self-esteem. But their soul is still beating. In the words of King Solomon, in the book of Song of Songs, I am asleep, but my heart is awake. So our conscious faculties, our conscious awareness and consciousness may be asleep. Or at least everything is under cover and concealment and hidden, but your heart is awake, the soul is awake. Somewhere there's that pilot flame. So if you plant the seeds, it will ultimately emerge. Quicker or slower is up to our willpower, our sometimes desperation, and feeling that this evil is worse than that evil. I'm telling you the way it is. I'm not going to say that people just get an epiphany overnight and it works. Sometimes that happens. But that too is usually a buildup. The epiphany comes after many different stimulation. But if it comes overnight, I'll be the happiest person for you and for everyone. Just being realistic. But the realistic says there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And it's not the light of an oncoming train. So we have to look at the things that we trust and we don't trust. And what I suggest always is begin slowly. If you try to bite off more than you can chew, it often backfires. Find things you do trust. Let's say you meet someone, you have a friend. Find the things you trust and build on that. Don't try to do it all. Because often what happens is children who've been hurt, what do? They want it all. I've been thirsty for so long, just let me drink it all. And you can end up choking on what you're drinking. You have to build it slowly. You find someone you meet, there's some trust, build on that trust. Expand it. Foundations aren't built overnight, especially foundations that have been hurt. So you need to take your time and let the process evolve. But push it. Don't let it just stagnate. Push it. You're looking for that. And if you say to yourself, here's a person I don't really trust, then I'm not sure why they're in your life. If they have to be due to work or family, fine. So you keep a minimal contact, but don't look to them for things to trust. This is another thing that happens. Sometimes in our immature search for security, and I say that in a negative way, a condescending way. I mean immature meaning that child is desperate for love, will sometimes just try to look for everywhere and even go to people that may not be the ones that will give it to you. So allow it to be deliberate. Allow to identify those that you feel that a person you can trust and build upon that. And that's where you put your focus. Now, when I say people to trust, doesn't always mean trust in the deepest level. It can be trust in conversation, good advice, studying together. That's always a good way to test the waters. Or even emotional conversations. Every person in their own way. Trust breeds trust. Mistrust breeds mistrust. So we have to look at the ingredients that we've been discussing. The trust, the security, the consistency. You feel good. You don't feel controlled. You don't feel dominated. You don't feel overwhelmed or imposed upon. All those ingredients, look for the people around you. Now, obviously, the goal would be, in talking about relationships in the context of marriage and finding your soulmate, the goal is to find that person. But that doesn't mean you can't do things right now that help you get to that place. As I said, trust builds trust. The trust we build in our homes with our parents will help us build trust with others that are strangers. That's one thing. Next thing is, build security in your life. A bird needs a nest. A building needs a foundation. A tree needs roots. Find roots. Roots are not always in human beings. They're in beliefs and in value systems. Today especially, with so much of our outer lives disrupted, it's a tremendous opportunity. Because till now, when we needed some numbness or we needed some relief or some pleasure, I'm going to a new restaurant. I'm going to a sports game. I'm going to the theater. I'm going to a movie. I'm traveling. Oh, that's a big one. Travel requires plans. I'm going shopping. Now, I'm not taking away from any of that, but they're all, at the end of the day, they are superficial. They are Band-Aids. They're temporary reliefs. Now we have an opportunity Look at your values. Your values are your roots, because values are sustainable. I should say values are forever. They are eternal. So that's ingredient number 2. Look at values and act on it. Volunteering, showing kindness and goodness, sharing, doing things that live up to your values. Those enduring values, they build your inner security, your inner foundation. And finally, point 3, which is a theme I've talked about so often, one that needs to be discussed more and more. It's a Hebrew word used in Hasidic and the mystical teachings called bittul. Bittul means it's a combination of modesty, humility, suspending yourself for something greater than yourself. It is actually the most important ingredient of all. Now, of course, when there's no trust and no security, it's very hard to have bittul. Because why would you suddenly allow yourself to suspend? Because all you have are your own tools, your own arsenal. Those are your weapons, your armor. But bittul means the ability to be flexible, to yield. Remember the point I made earlier? The building that sways, that has that element of flexibility, not to be rigid. Often rigidness. At times we need to be rigid. Obviously values and other things, foundational elements. But sometimes being rigidity is a result, did I say rigidness? Rigidity is a result of actually fear. So you become very strong, you dig in, because you want to protect yourself. You'll see love and trust always has an element of, okay, I'm not so obstinate or stubborn about a particular position. It's a person I love, I trust them, and you trust them even when they say something that you may not fully agree with or fully understand, for that matter. That's what bittul is. But to build bittul, you need trust. Because you don't want a bittul that is annihilation. Oh, I'll completely suspend my own interests for another. If it's coming from a place of weakness or fear, that's not a healthy sign. But if it's coming from a place of strength, I'm very secure with myself. Therefore, I can be giving. I don't need to be locked into a particular position. So all this, my friends, leads us to the key ingredients in building strong and unbreakable relationships. In the last program, which was 2 weeks ago, we spoke about vulnerability. Celebrating vulnerability is a key to indestructibility. Now, it sounds paradoxical. Vulnerability sounds so negative. So I refer you back to that program 2 weeks ago. It's very much, you can say, a sister to this conversation we're having now. The ability to let go. But letting go can be terrifying, especially when you've been hurt. That's why I go back to creating environments, finding in people, places where you could be vulnerable, where you could be trusting. Because that in turn creates all the other ingredients, and it builds upon each other. So don't look at it as all or nothing. Look for pieces. Just like when we build a structure, you do it brick by brick, piece by piece. And same thing with foundational elements. What's working for you is that even when you start working on it, you suddenly emerges things that may have been dormant and buried deep in your psyche before you were hurt. Now, whatever I've said here is not just for people who've been hurt, just for the record. It's really identifying the ingredients. For those that have not been hurt and have had that nurturing, it's much easier to access. There, the challenge will be, am I focusing on superficial, impermanent things, or am I focusing on the center and heart of what a true relationship is? If you're focusing on external things, you're going to be disappointed because nothing external lasts. If you focus on the internal things, then you find things that are enduring and eternal. And as I've discussed many times, and you can find a lot more about this on meaningfullife.com, that ultimately in a relationship, besides physical and emotional and intellectual compatibility, you need spiritual compatibility. And spiritual compatibility means you both share a vision that's greater than each of you. What kind of mark you want to leave in this universe? What kind of home you want to build? The values. That, ultimately, is what creates eternity. You know why? Because though we are mortal, as the question at the opening of this program, though we're mortal and everything in our lives erodes, ages, deteriorates, perishes, but our souls do not. Because the divine within us, which is the immortal within us, when you access it, and with bittul you suspend your mortality to dedicate it to something greater than yourself, and if that greater is eternal, you become an extension of that eternity, and your relationship in turn benefits from it tremendously. That, my friends, is the key elements of building strong and unbreakable relationships. This is Rabbi Jacobson, Meaningful Life Center. If you have benefited from this, I'm sure you'll want to read more. Go to meaningfullife.com. Many resources there, many programs, schedules. Please subscribe. There's a list of different things you can receive literally on a daily basis, a whole calendar of programs that we've been producing, especially in these trying times. Stay well, stay healthy, love, trust. Use this time of disruption and upheaval to build deeper foundations, deeper roots. Be blessed, and we're here Wednesday, 8:30 every Wednesday, this Global Masterclass. Again, go to meaningfullife.com. Thank you so much.
This program is brought to you by the Meaningful Life Center. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at meaningfullife.com/donate.